Good morning, Keele. Again, good morning, Keele. Good morning, everyone. Let us all sing this song from our hearts. Let's sing all together. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes
of my heart.
I want to see you, Lord. I want to see you. To see you high, to see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Open the eyes and open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. We want to see you right now, Father. We want to see you, Jesus, in this very place. Open the eyes and open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Oh, open the eyes
of my heart.
I want to see you. I want to see you. To see you high. Oh, to see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy. To see you high, to see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out and pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. And we're all crying out to you, Lord. And holy, 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 holy. I want to see you. Holy, 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 holy. You are holy, Lord. Holy, 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 holy. I want to see you. We want to see you. And I want to see you. And I want to see you, Lord. And I want to see you. Oh, you are the Lord, the famous one, famous one. Great is your name in all the earth. The heavens declare your glorious, glorious. Great is your fame beyond the earth. You've done and yet to do with famous one. Great is your name in all the earth. The heavens declare you're glorious, glorious. Great is your fame beyond the earth. The morning star is shining through, and every eye is watching you. Revealed by nature and miracles, you are beautiful. You alone are God. You are the Lord, the famous one, famous one. Great is your name in all the earth. The heavens declare you're glorious, glorious. Great is your fame beyond the earth. And you are the Lord, the famous one, famous one. Great is your name in all the earth. The heavens declare, and the heavens declare you're glorious, glorious. Great is your fame beyond the earth. Oh, soul, are you weary and troubled? No light in the darkness you see. There's light for a look at the Savior, and life more abundant and free. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Through death into life everlasting, he passed and we follow him there. Oh, sin no more had dominion, for more than conquerors we are. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. His word shall not fail you, he promised. Believe him and all will be well. Then go to a world that is dying, his perfect salvation to tell. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Let us all sit down right now. I see the King of glory coming on the clouds with fire. The whole earth shakes, the whole earth shakes. I see his love and mercy washing over all our sin. The people sing, the people sing, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. I see generation rising up to take their place with selfless faith, with selfless faith. I see a near revival stirring as we pray and seek. We're on our knees, we're on our knees. We cry out to you, Lord. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Oh, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Heal my heart and make it clean. Open up my eyes, open up my eyes to the things unseen. Show me how to love like you have loved me. Oh, break my heart for what breaks yours. Everything I am for your kingdom's cause. As I walk from birth into eternity. And we're crying out to you, Jesus. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. 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 Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna in the highest.
Some people are describers. Others are demonstrators. Which are you? What kind of person do you prefer? If it's Sheila describing where she thinks she last saw my keys, I would much prefer her to demonstrate that she was right by handing them to me, rather than me trying to figure out her description of where they might or may not be. I vote for demonstrators. I would much prefer someone demonstrate how to put anything from IKEA together rather than having to read the instructions myself and do it. And I would much prefer someone to demonstrate just pretty much anything, because when I see somebody doing something, it's much more understandable than reading about it or trying to figure out how this may go to that. This is one of the reasons why YouTube is such an important thing. We don't know how to do something, we go to YouTube at our own peril, or perhaps we do learn something every once in a while about how to do things. But we like to see it demonstrated. For some people, though, all they need to understand is something. It's just a few words to describe something. And I know people like Bill would much prefer to read something than he would to listen to something or watch something. He can read it faster than he can listen. He's kind of rare in that way. I'm the opposite. Sometimes, in the case of like a well-written novel, a description, a speech, a dialogue is all you need to put you right in the action. But having said that, whoever it was that said a picture is worth 1,000 words is right. It's true. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and the more abstract or theoretical or complex those words and concepts are, the more important a picture is, so that we can truly see and understand what's going on. Well, the Gospel of John is telling us that in Jesus we have the Word become flesh. How's that for a complicated concept? We have the ultimate picture of who Yahweh is in the flesh, what he looks like and how he acts in the flesh. As we look at the passage we're looking at today in chapter 9 of John, page 905 and 906 of the Congregational Bible, blue book underneath the chair in front of you, somewhere around you. This is a passage that gives us, in one picture, the image of the Gospel of John. In one picture, the image of who Jesus is and why he came. If we see this picture, we get all that we need to see. As you turn there, since I've already mentioned the Word become flesh, let me just remind you of how John's Gospel begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to those who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. As we've gone through John 7 and 8, we've been digging deep into Jesus' amazing testimonies about himself in conjunction with the Feast of Tabernacles. The result being that the religious leaders attacked Jesus because of this very testimony, this bold and amazing testimony that he continues to ramp up and move forward through, till at the end of chapter 8 he declares himself to be the I Am, Yahweh. In a festival that pointed back to the exodus of God's people out of Egypt and their wilderness wanderings in which Yahweh brought them safely to the promised land, we have Jesus pointing the way to the new creation. In a festival that celebrates living water and light and points to the promise of the Messianic age, we have Jesus claiming to be the source of living water and the very light of the world. Claims are one thing, but what does it, being the light of the world, look like? And what exactly does the light of the world do? What's his job description? That's the picture that John 9 paints. Beginning with verse 1, we read, "As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. John begins with this phrase, as he went along. This is just a common way to let us know that John's switching scenes. But the context tells us that Jesus and his disciples are still in Jerusalem. And since John 9 is tied to the Feast of Tabernacles through this connecting reference to Jesus being the light of the world, and John 10 gives us the time frame of the Feast of Dedication, or as we call it, Hanukkah, we know that this account of the man born blind is sometime between the Festival of Tabernacles, which is mid-fall, to the Festival of Dedication, which is early December. Now, clearly, John is underlining the fact that this man has been born blind. And he's underlining that this is an important detail that we all have to pay attention to. Not only does John give us this detail immediately in the first verse, the disciples repeat it in the next verse. And then when the Pharisees question the man's parents, it's repeated again. And then finally, when the Pharisees dismiss the man who was born blind, they allude to the fact that he was born blind and that he was born in sin. They basically agree with the question that the disciples are asking. So this man is characterized from the beginning to the end of this whole account as a man who was born blind. We don't even really know his name. There's this one constant underlining thought throughout the story. And what this means is that John isn't just giving us a detail to add color to our picture. There's something significant in the fact that this man was born blind. Something that he wants us to ponder, to meditate on. Something that needs to inform our reading and our interpretation of the passage. Keep that in mind and we'll come back to it. How exactly did John and the rest of the disciples know that this man had been born blind? That he was blind from birth? We're not told. Was he a well-known beggar in Jerusalem? Was his story part of the public record? Is there something about his appearance that indicated he had obviously always been blind? Did Jesus tell them? We don't know. How they know that this man was born blind doesn't matter. That they know that he was born blind matters a lot. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The disciples' question seems kind of strange and foreign to our ears. As a matter of fact, maybe even offensive. To somehow connect blindness with sin. Unless you're familiar with Job's friends, who likewise wrongly blamed Job's suffering on some secret sin as well. Clearly, the disciples see a connection between sin and suffering. We don't necessarily, although we do. We just might put it in different context. The thing is that sin and suffering do have a connection with each other. The fall brought alienation and suffering into the human condition in general terms. And yes, even specific sins can lead to specific suffering. A drunk driver can be the source of their own suffering or the suffering of those around them. For example, if they're involved in an accident that maims somebody or kills somebody or ends up having them put in jail. But does everyone who's ever driven under the influence been arrested or killed someone while they were driving? No. It's not a specific thing. There is no formula of cause and effect between sin and suffering. It's not a multiplication table. It's not a math equation. The fact is that some people sin and get away with it, and others suffer without any clear cause to their suffering. And that's the disciples' problem. and it's our problem as well. We want a predictable God who provides a just, predictable life, right? If we're good and faithful, we want success and good health. That's the contract we thought we were signing. If we see someone breaking the rules, particularly if they're breaking them and causing us to suffer by doing that, we want justice. We want them punished. We want a world that makes sense. If something in the world seems unfair and you believe in a God who is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-fair, one way of getting around the problem is to say that life only seems unfair, but it actually isn't. We just don't know the full story. For many people, this is the only way they can fall asleep at night. But how do you deal with someone born blind if you believe that's connected to sin in some way? The only logical thing must be that it was either this man who sinned in the womb, although that seems like a stretch. I mean, how much trouble can you really get into in the womb? Or perhaps it was the sins of his parents that caused him to suffer. Even though Scripture tells us that the sins of the fathers won't be visited upon the children. It doesn't matter how realistic our speculation is. In a world full of questions and chaos and things that cause us to lose sleep, any answer will do. It doesn't have to make sense. That's why we have the internet. So the disciples' reasoning defaults to sin being the source of this man's problem. Because if God is just, human sinfulness somehow must be at the root of all human suffering. There's a logic to this. The assumption was, therefore, that the victim was to blame. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this kind of thinking is still alive and well in a bunch of different and disturbing contexts today. There's no shortage of victims who suffer further victimization by being blamed for what's happened to them, just like Job was by his friends. Thankfully, Jesus doesn't go there. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, he said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Jesus is quite clear. This man's suffering is not the result of his sin, period. Of course, that doesn't mean this man is sinless. It just means that he has done nothing to create his condition. But what does Jesus mean when he says this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him? Does Jesus mean that this man has to suffer from birth until the time Jesus and his disciples come along? Just so Jesus can heal him and make Yahweh look good? God is sovereign. He could certainly do that if it served his purposes. But is that really how God works? Would Yahweh put this man through a lifetime of suffering just to be a cog in the Vote for Jesus Messiah campaign? I don't think so. The verse can just as reasonably be translated, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, period. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. In this case, the point isn't that this man was born blind so that Jesus could heal him and glorify God. No, the point was that the point has nothing to do with how or why this man was born blind. It doesn't actually reference why this man was born blind. What Jesus is saying is that the act of healing this man, the act of recreation, of bringing light into the darkness of this man's life is the very thing that he came to do. This is what light looks like when it's working. In this context, Jesus isn't commenting on why this man was born blind, other than it had nothing to do with sin. What it does have to do with was God's sovereign plan of recreation, of bringing light into darkness. Jesus was with us. His working was to restore. His working was light. And this man came into contact with that work. You know, let's face it, life is messy. Pat answers really aren't answers at all. The world is darker and stranger than we like to admit. Much of human experience creates confusion and questions. We all want answers to the why me we face. We all grope around in the dark, but Jesus came to bring light. He came to bring life. Jesus was responding with compassion to someone trapped in darkness. God didn't create this man to live in darkness, but he did send Jesus to be the means of bringing him into the light. See the difference? As N.T. Wright puts it, the chaos and misery of this present world is, it seems, the raw materials out of which the loving, wise, and just God is making his new creation. That's what's going on here. Picking things up in verse 6. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. We're told the name of the pool, Siloam, means sent. That's interesting because over 20 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus is described as the one who was sent by God. In other words, the blind man is being told to go wash in the place called sent by the one who was sent by God. The point being that Jesus is the source of this healing, not the pool. The man was obedient and was healed. He believed and was healed. Although exactly what he believed, we don't know. He just went and did what he was told to do. It's about all that he knows at this point in time. What happens next is that the blind man is questioned by his neighbors and by those who are familiar to seeing him beg on the street. And then he's questioned by the Pharisees. And then the man's parents are questioned by the Pharisees. And then the man is questioned a second time by the Pharisees. Each time the questioning gets a little more heated and dramatic, and it becomes alive with conflict and truth and error and rebelliousness and growth. In the questioning of the neighbors, what's really interesting is they recognize him, but again, they don't. There's some discussion going on. Some believe it's him. Others weren't so sure. The neighbors are divided over the identity of this guy. Some just think that he kind of looks like that guy. Clearly, there's a difference between this man who was blind and this man who can now see. A discernible difference. In many ways, he is now a different person because he can see. The man himself insists that he was indeed the same man, the man that Jesus was the source of healing. The neighbors don't know what to do with this, so they take him to the Pharisees to let the experts sort things out. Make it somebody else's problem. It's then that we find out that the day that Jesus healed this man was the Sabbath. Once again, we're connecting back to the paralyzed man that Jesus healed that began the whole section of this John that we've been looking at. The festival section, it's called. At the pool of Bethsaida, this man who had been paralyzed for 36, 38 years in John 5, Jesus heals him on the Sabbath as well, and that creates a confrontation with the religious leaders. In the case of the man born blind, the Pharisees are divided over the miracle. In verse 16 we read, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such a sign? So they were divided. That's interesting. man did some work on the Sabbath. He's a sinner. Black and white. Yeah, but if he's a sinner, how could he do what he did? Good question. They struggle with it. You know, it's interesting. Jesus tells his disciples that the Father had sent him to do his work of recreating. Some of the religious leaders can't comprehend that someone sent from God would heal on the Sabbath. But you kind of think that God would like healing on the Sabbath, wouldn't he? Others were saying, yeah, but Jesus, he just did a God thing. And how can he not be from God if he just did a God thing? That's a good question. The question is, where does that go? Where does that question take them? Where does it take the man born blind? Where does it take the Pharisees? That's what we're meant to look at as we're spectators watching this picture develop. In verse 17 we read, then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. The blind man moves from describing Jesus as the man Jesus to he's a prophet. The blind man has not only begun to see physically, he's starting to see spiritually as well. For the Pharisees, the problem is, what do you do with Jesus when Jesus doesn't fit with your idea of someone who is sent from God? They decide to try and disprove the miracle by bringing in the men's parents. They ask them if this man was in fact their son and if he really was born blind. The answer, beginning with verse 20, is, we know he is our son. The parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. We're told the parents answered in this way because the Pharisees had already decided to throw out of the synagogue anyone who testified that Jesus was the Messiah. Underlying that phrase, they had already decided. They had already picked sides. They had already actively tried to suppress interest in Jesus. This man's parents were right to be so guarded and defensive in their answer. Their son couldn't escape the Pharisees' questions, but perhaps they could. What we need to understand is that being thrown out of the synagogue would have impacted every aspect of their lives, socially, economically, practically. The threat was huge and far-reaching, and his parents were rightfully afraid. Beginning with verse 24, we read, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. What a warped comment that's made. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Here they are, the religious leaders, the experts, those who had dedicated their lives to knowing the Scripture, to prayer, to sacrifice, to obeying the law, to serving God, to teaching God's word. These are deeply religious people who take their faith very seriously. They're not hypocrites in that sense at all. And for them, the way to give glory to God was for this man to declare Jesus a sinner. I love the man's reply. He colors within the lines. He just simply says, you're the religious experts. You can discuss whether or not he's a sinner. All I know is I can see. I'll tell you what I do know. You deal with what I don't know, okay? Interesting. He says, this is the undeniable fact. I was blind, but now I see. They keep questioning him and asking him to explain exactly what Jesus did, looking for loopholes, looking for something that they can use against Jesus. At this, the man born blind gets frustrated and with them, and he asks them if they want to be his disciples too. The man has gone from describing Jesus as a man to describing him as a prophet. The Pharisees have told us that they would throw anyone out of the synagogue who would declare him as Messiah. And now this man born blind describes himself as a disciple. It's someone who desires to follow and learn from and be like Jesus. This is when things start to melt down, and they declare that they're disciples of Moses. In their minds, being a disciple of Moses means they couldn't be a disciple of Jesus. It doesn't matter that Moses pointed to Jesus. They declared that they know Moses, but they don't know this man. This man that they're actively throwing people out of the synagogue for talking about. They don't know where he comes from. Picking things up in verse 30, the man answered, "Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out, excommunicated. No longer has his monogrammed seat in the synagogue. Ultimately, what this man declares is that this miracle demands examination. It demands explanation. And the only explanation there is for this kind of a miracle, this miracle that's never happened before, is that it must be a God thing. Which means Jesus must be from God. This is kind of logic here, right? It's not that hard to see his logic here, and it makes pretty good sense. There really isn't any other explanation. To this, they pull the "who do you think you are" card, which is usually the best way to just end a discussion or an argument that you know you're not going to win. Who do you think you are? You've been born in sin, steeped in sin at birth, he says, or they say, verifying again that he was indeed blind from birth. They've proven that part of it, which just strengthens Jesus' testimony and this blind man's testimony even more. But he's thrown out of the synagogue. This man's testimony has cost him. This isn't a game. He's no longer part of this community of faith. And there's not another synagogue down the street. As the story has progressed, Jesus' identity is more fully revealed. He is Jesus. Then he's called the prophet. Then he's the Christ, or the Messiah. And then finally, he's declared to be from God. What this means is that the more the Pharisees try to discount Jesus' identity, the clearer Jesus' true identity becomes. Picking things up in verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. He worshiped him. He worshiped this man. Just like with the paralyzed man in John 5, Jesus returns to the man who was born blind after his healing and after some things have gone on. The paralyzed man's unchanged by the miracle in chapter 5. He sides with he sides with the religious leaders. He rats Jesus out to the religious leaders. And Jesus warns him to stop sinning or something worse may happen to him, but he doesn't listen. There's no indication that the paralyzed man will grow in faith or in obedience. What he's received from Jesus brings no act of worship, no thanksgiving. There's no indication that he becomes one of his disciples. He has been healed by Jesus, but his heart remains unaffected. Not so the man born blind. All through this account, this man has been the model of a disciple. I love the fact that this man shows a slow, steady growth in his knowledge of Jesus. He doesn't know it all. He doesn't claim to know it all. He claims to really know nothing. And that's an important attitude to have. He has an encounter with Jesus and he's healed, but the physical healing, other than being the catalyst for all that transpires with the Pharisees, is almost incidental in this story. I mean, it's not. He can see. I'm sure he was happy about that. But that's not the most incredible part of the story. It's just the jumping off point to a journey for him being able to see more and more clearly the spiritual truth of what had happened and who was standing before him. You know, after hearing the man had been thrown out of the synagogue, Jesus comes to him and reveals more of his light. He asks the man, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" You know, this, of course, is Jesus' favorite description of himself because he's claiming to be the eschatological figure from Daniel 7. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is the one that will never be destroyed. That's Jesus. That's his faith verse. That's how he sees himself, because that is who he is. And so he asks this man who knows, because this is one of the most popular, well-known messianic passages we have in the Old Testament. He knows what he's talking about. He just doesn't know who he's referring to. It's interesting. The NIV translates the words, the same word, sir, in verse 36, and Lord in verse 38. Same word. Who is he, sir? Just a sign of respect. And Lord, I believe. It's right when it translates it this way. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, used in Jesus' day, used in the New Testament times, in Paul's day, this is the word that's used for the covenant name, for Yahweh. This man takes the final step of believing and worshiping. He bows before him. He prostrates himself. The more he has been challenged to thinking about Jesus, and the more he's growing in his faith, until finally, with Jesus standing before him and seeing Jesus for the first time, he believes and he worships. There's no greater testimony of faith in John's gospel to Jesus until we get to Thomas, who after the resurrection says, "My Lord and my God." Meanwhile, picking things up in verse 39, Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him saying this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." What an interesting way to end this. Your guilt remains. Jesus says, "For judgment I have come into this world." Really? What about John 3:17, when we're told, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him? The word translated as judgment is a word that speaks more about the process by which someone finds themselves guilty, rather than actual punishment itself. So Jesus came to save the world, but this account of this man born blind so strongly illustrates that the very act of saving can also be the very act of condemning. Think about it. The man born blind was saved, but the Pharisees, well, what does Jesus say here? He says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. In other words, if you were making a choice because of ignorance, it'd be a different story, but you're not. You claim that you see. You claim that you know. And you reject me. Your guilt remains. You've just seen something that has proved who I am to one person, and you've used it to cast him out of God's people. You tried to make him call me a sinner. You refused to look at Moses, who pointed to my day and said, behold, there will be a prophet who comes. Your guilt remains. It's such an interesting way to put things. Jesus says, because they claim they can see, their guilt remains. Their guilt remains. To me, that suggests that there's a possibility that it could be taken away. And the reason why it remains is because of the choice that they're making, not the offer that Jesus is making. Does that make sense? In other words, there's a difference between not knowing and willfully rejecting. And continuing on in chapter 3 of John, just after the verse we talked about, I came into the world not to condemn it, but to save it, we read this. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Here is the painting on the wall that illustrates this very point. The Pharisees declare their innocence. They declare they don't need the light that Jesus is providing. They claim they can see without Jesus, so their guilt remains. Salvation and judgment come through the very same event, all based on what we do with the evidence of Jesus' claims and actions. It's left up to us to watch and look and observe and ask the important questions and come to our own conclusion. That's how much God loves and respects us. John 9 is a picture that gives us a clear vision of Jesus. And what's interesting is that we get to be spectators in the gallery watching the picture unfold. We don't have to figure out what's what. We already know who Jesus claims to be. We already know who Jesus is. We already know. We have proof before us that he's the light of the world. We already know that this man was born blind. We know that Jesus heals him. As observers, all these things can be clearly seen. We don't really have to come to conclusion here. What we're doing is we're watching what other people do with the information we already know to be true. That's what John's trying to do here. We watch this man born blind acknowledge his ignorance and slowly grow in his faith. And we see the Pharisees declaring their knowledge, and slowly we'll watch them descend into darkness. We see how the light of this world works. We also see that following the light leads to challenges and to rejection and to persecution by those who claim to have the light and think they know all that they need to know. In this picture, the light of choosing shines brightly. We understand that light is light, and either we respond to it or we reject it. But we can't ignore it. No one in this story ignores this. To pretend we don't know doesn't change what we already have been shown. Why is it so important that this man was born blind? Why does John point this out time and time again throughout the whole passage? It's because this man's reality is everyone's reality. We're all born blind, spiritually speaking, aren't we? We know this, don't we? I mean, we all know that it's easier to make excuses than to ask for forgiveness. We all know that there's many things in our own lives that we cannot see, we don't want to face, and we much rather point out at the sins of others. Those people who we victimize even though they're already a victim. This man born blind was absolutely helpless when he came to see. There was nothing he could do to change his circumstances other than take the help that was offered when Jesus came to him. To follow his word and to find healing. At the same time, we all see in ourselves the attitude of the Pharisees sometimes. When confronted with light, what do? Do we look for loopholes? Now, that's old light, not new light. It's light. Do we refuse to believe? Do we declare ourselves superior, more informed, more evolved? Do we remain in our guilt because it's not that we don't know, it's just that we refuse to believe? As we come to the Lord's table, come knowing that there's nothing you bring with you. Any sight you have, any light that you have, any healing or growth that takes place is the result of Jesus' activity as the light of the world. What this means is that you need to continue to see clearly your need for Jesus continuing light in life. And that's why we have this every week. We come here declaring our dependence upon Christ every week. We always need his light. We always need his grace. We always need his help. We are not here because we're good. We're here because we're saved. We need to remind ourselves of that so we don't become Pharisees. We also need to remember that it's a process. The more we obey, the more we listen, the more we investigate who Jesus really is, the more we become like him. It's a process. Faith is a process. Growth is a process. It's a process in evaluating and looking at Jesus to see him clearer and clearer. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Lastly, Jesus told the Pharisees that they would remain in their guilt. Again, that suggests to me that they could have been released from their guilt. Jesus was offering to release them from their guilt, but they chose instead to remain in their guilt because they wanted to remain in control of their lives that were out of control. That's what us humans do. They refused to see what they saw so very clearly, what they tried to disprove so very vehemently, and they just couldn't. You know, we don't have to remain in our guilt. No one has to remain in their guilt. Jesus was trying to remove their guilt. That's why he was there. He came to save. But their own hearts became the means by which judgment came. Let's turn our eyes on Jesus as we meet around this table. And remember that we're not better than the Pharisees. And we are in blindness, even though we see. It's a progressive seeing more and more. It's about being humble. It's about admitting that we don't know everything. but that we have a Savior who does. Come and confess that as we meet at this table.
You are good when there's nothing good in me. You are love on display for all to see. You are hope in the darkness closes in. You are hope, you have covered all my sin. You are peace when my fear is crippling. You are true, even in my wandering. You are joy, you're the reason that I sing. You are life, in you death has lost its sting. And oh, I'm running to your arms, the riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign. You are more than my words will ever say. You are Lord, all creation will proclaim. You are here, in your presence I'm made whole. You are God, of all else I'm letting go. And oh, I'm running to your arms, the riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign. My heart will sing, no other name. Let's sing Jesus. My heart will sing, no other name. Jesus. My heart will sing, no other name. Jesus. My heart will sing, no other name. Jesus. And oh, I'm running to your arms, the riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever. I'm running to your arms, the riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace. Light of the world, forever reign.
Paul says, as often as we meet around this table, we declare the Lord's death until he returns. As you go out into the world this week, be light. Light not by pointing out other people's darkness. Light by showing people God's love. God bless.